There's a specific sequence that unfolds with remarkable consistency inside a narcissist's psychology after someone finally genuinely leaves them. And understanding this sequence changes something important about how you experience the aftermath of that leaving. Most people who exit these relationships spend the following weeks and months bracing for one of two things: either total indifferent silence or an immediate furious explosion. What actually tends to happen is neither of these, or rather, it's both of these and several other things besides, unfolding in a recognizable order that reveals far more about the psychology we've spent this entire series examining than any single reaction ever could on its own. Today, we're walking through 6 stages, and I want to be clear about something before we start, because it matters for how you use this information. This isn't a roadmap designed to help you predict their behavior so you can manage it, engage with it, or wait around for a specific stage to arrive before you feel safe moving forward with your own life. It's the opposite. Understanding this sequence is meant to free you from needing to track it in real time at all, because once you see the whole shape of it laid out clearly, you'll understand why none of these 6 stages, however they unfold or however long each one lasts, actually require anything from you in order to run their full course. Let's start with the first stage, because it's often the most confusing for the person who just left, precisely because it rarely looks the way anyone expects it to: minimization. In the immediate aftermath of the relationship ending, particularly if the narcissist was the one who technically initiated some final conflict, or if there's any ambiguity about who ended things and why, a strange and specific reaction often surfaces first before anything resembling grief, anger, or genuine loss. The relationship, and your absence from it, gets treated, at least outwardly, as almost insignificant. Comments to mutual friends might suggest the breakup was inevitable, unremarkable, barely worth discussing. There might be a rapid pivot toward presenting an image of unaffected ease, sometimes even active indifference posted or performed specifically where it might reach you. This stage is worth understanding precisely because it's frequently misread by the person who left as genuine evidence that they never mattered as much as they believed, that the narcissist has simply easily moved on without a second thought, confirming whatever insecurities the relationship may have already instilled about their own significance. But minimization at this early stage is rarely an accurate reflection of internal experience. Remember what we've traced throughout this entire series about how a narcissist's psychology handles threat. The ego doesn't process a significant loss by immediately honestly grieving it. It processes threat by first denying that the threat is significant at all, because acknowledging real loss this early would require confronting exactly the kind of vulnerability this entire psychological structure exists to avoid. This is why minimization often looks so convincing from the outside, and why it's genuinely painful to witness if you're still checking, even occasionally, to see how they're doing without you. The performance of unaffected calm isn't necessarily conscious deception in every case. Often, it's the mind's fastest available defense, reached for automatically, the same way any defense mechanism gets reached for before slower, more honest processing has time to catch up. Underneath this performed indifference, something considerably less settled is usually beginning to stir, but it hasn't yet gained enough momentum to override the initial protective impulse to simply declare the whole thing unimportant. Let's talk about the second stage, because it tends to emerge once minimization starts losing its ability to hold. Once enough time has passed that pure denial becomes harder to sustain convincingly, even to the narcissist themselves: narrative construction. This stage is worth examining in real detail, because it's one of the most psychologically revealing of all 6. and it explains behavior that often confuses and hurts people who hear about it secondhand, sometimes months after leaving, through mutual friends or family members still in contact with their former partner. Narrative construction involves the active building of a story about the relationship's ending, one that positions the narcissist favorably, and often, though not always, positions you unfavorably in direct proportion. This isn't simply venting or processing pain through explanation, which most people do to some degree after any significant relationship ends. It's something more deliberate and considerably more strategic, even when it isn't fully conscious as strategy. The story that gets built and told to others often includes selective details, exaggerations of your flaws, minimization or complete omission of the narcissist's own behavior, and sometimes, in more severe cases, outright fabrication of events that never actually happened the way they're being described. Here's what's worth understanding about why this stage emerges with such consistency, and why it often surfaces specifically once minimization starts to fail. Remember everything we've traced throughout this series about what a narcissist's sense of stability actually depends on: ongoing external confirmation of their own significance and worth. A breakup, especially one where they weren't the one who chose to end things, represents a genuine threat to this stability, because it implies, whether stated directly or not, that they were found insufficient, that someone chose to leave rather than stay. Narrative construction functions as a direct countermeasure to this implication. By controlling the story others hear, the narcissist attempts to control the verdict others reach, ensuring that even if the relationship ended, their own image, their own sense of having been right, justified, or blameless remains intact in the eyes of whatever audience remains available to them. This is worth sitting with directly, because it explains something that trips up a lot of people navigating this specific stage from the outside: the sheer confidence and apparent sincerity with which these reconstructed narratives often get delivered. This isn't usually experienced by the narcissist as lying, at least not consciously. Remember what we discussed in earlier explorations about idealization and its opposite, devaluation, and how quickly a narcissist's internal experience of someone can shift from one extreme to the other. Once the relationship has ended and you've moved into the devalued category in their internal system, previously positive memories and interpretations often get genuinely, retroactively reconstructed to match this new framing. The narrative they're telling others frequently feels true to them in the moment of telling, not because it's accurate, but because their own memory has already been reorganized to support whatever version of events currently protects their stability most effectively. This has real practical implications worth naming clearly, because it affects how you might want to think about your own reputation and relationships during this period. If you're hearing secondhand that a former partner is telling a version of events that doesn't match what you actually experienced, it's worth understanding that this reconstruction was almost inevitable, not because you did something wrong that invited it, but because it's simply what this particular psychology tends to do when its stability is genuinely threatened by an ending it didn't fully control. This doesn't mean you're obligated to simply accept whatever version circulates without ever correcting genuinely damaging misinformation, particularly in situations with real consequences attached: shared custody, professional reputation, or ongoing contact with people whose opinion genuinely matters to your daily life. But it does mean recognizing this stage for the predictable pattern it actually is, rather than experiencing each new distorted account as a fresh personal betrayal requiring an equally fresh emotional reaction every time it resurfaces. What we haven't yet covered are the 4 remaining stages, each one revealing a different layer of how this psychology processes genuine loss over time, moving from these earlier, more defensive stages towards something considerably more complex as denial and narrative control eventually, inevitably, start to lose their effectiveness. Understanding exactly what happens next and why these later stages often reveal something the earlier ones were specifically designed to prevent anyone, including the narcissists themselves, from ever having to see clearly is exactly where we need to go next. Let's move into the third stage because it tends to emerge once narrative construction, however convincingly performed, starts running up against a problem it can't actually solve. The narrative might satisfy an audience, but it does nothing to address the underlying instability the breakup actually created. This is where we see the third stage, often the most visible and the most confusing to witness from the outside: testing behavior. This is a pattern we've touched on in earlier explorations throughout this series, but it deserves close, specific attention here, because in the context of this particular sequence, it reveals something important about timing that's easy to miss if you're only looking at individual incidents rather than the broader pattern they belong to. Testing behavior in this stage tends to be relatively low risk and low commitment, at least initially, because the narcissist's own uncertainty about the relationship's true status hasn't fully resolved yet. This might look like a seemingly random text referencing an inside joke from earlier in the relationship, sent without any obvious agenda. It might look like liking an old photo or commenting on something you've posted publicly, testing whether you notice, whether you respond, whether the door that theoretically closed when you left has actually, functionally, remained closed or not. Each of these small probes serves the same underlying function: gathering information about whether their old methods of reaching you still produce any of their old reliable effects. This is worth understanding precisely because it explains why testing behavior often seems to contradict everything happening in the narrative construction stage simultaneously. It's entirely possible, and actually quite common, for someone to be telling friends a story where you're framed unfavorably and the breakup barely registers as significant, while also, in private, sending exactly the kind of low-stakes message specifically designed to test whether you're still reachable. These two behaviors aren't actually contradictory once you understand what each one is doing. Narrative construction protects the external image. Testing behavior gathers private information about actual access. Both serve the same underlying goal: restoring some version of the stability the relationship's ending disrupted, just through different channels aimed at different audiences. Let's talk about the fourth stage, because it represents a significant shift from everything we've discussed so far, moving away from strategies aimed at controlling how the situation looks and towards something considerably more genuine, even though it's often expressed in ways that still don't look particularly healthy from the outside: grief leakage. This stage tends to emerge once enough time has passed and enough testing behavior has failed to restore the old dynamic that the underlying loss becomes considerably harder to keep fully suppressed beneath denial and narrative control. This is worth naming carefully because grief leakage rarely looks like straightforward, recognizable grief. It doesn't usually involve calm reflection or open acknowledgement of what was actually lost. Instead, it tends to emerge sideways through irritability that seems disconnected from its actual trigger, through sudden intensity directed at unrelated situations, through periods of uncharacteristic withdrawal or uncharacteristic recklessness that friends and family might notice without understanding the actual source. Sometimes it surfaces as sudden, unexpected emotional volatility during conversations that have nothing directly to do with the relationship at all, a kind of pressure finally finding an outlet, even though the outlet rarely connects clearly back to its actual cause. Here's why this stage is worth understanding as genuinely distinct from the earlier ones, even though it can be harder to recognize clearly from the outside. This is often the first point in the entire sequence where something resembling authentic processing begins, rather than pure defense or strategy. This doesn't mean the narcissist has suddenly developed the capacity for healthy grieving in the way most people would recognize it. It means the earlier defenses have started to genuinely strain under the weight of loss that's proven more difficult to fully deny or control than initially expected. This stage is often invisible to you directly, unless you're still receiving information secondhand, because it tends to unfold in contexts that have nothing to do with you at all, in their workplace, their other relationships, their general daily functioning, revealing itself through disruption rather than through anything that would ever specifically identify its actual source. Now let's talk about the fifth stage, one that connects directly back to patterns we've discussed extensively throughout this entire series. Escalated pursuit, or in some cases, escalated devaluation, depending on which direction the underlying insecurity ends up expressing itself. This stage tends to emerge once grief leakage has built enough pressure that something more decisive needs to happen, one way or another, in order to restore some sense of resolution. For some narcissists, this pressure resolves through intensified attempts at reconciliation, the vulnerability performances, the retroactive idealization, the timing around visible signs of your own thriving, all patterns we've traced in detail throughout earlier explorations in this series. For others, the same underlying pressure resolves instead through escalated devaluation, an intensification of the narrative construction discussed earlier, now delivered with considerably more venom, sometimes moving into territory that could reasonably be described as smear campaigns, deliberate attempts to damage your reputation, your relationships, or your standing in shared communities. This divergence is worth understanding clearly, because it reveals something important about what actually determines which direction this fifth stage takes. It depends heavily on whether the narcissist still believes reconciliation is genuinely available to them. If some part of them still believes you might return, pursuit tends to intensify, because pursuit still holds the promise of restoring the old dynamic directly. If reconciliation seems genuinely foreclosed, if you've made clear through sustained, consistent behavior that return isn't on the table, the same underlying pressure often redirects toward devaluation instead, because if the relationship can't be restored, at least the narrative can be controlled thoroughly enough to ensure the narcissist emerges from the story looking justified rather than rejected. This is worth sitting with directly because it has real practical implications for anyone currently navigating this specific stage. If you're experiencing intensified pursuit, understand that it's not evidence of deepening love finally surfacing, but evidence that reconciliation still feels available in their mind, which is exactly why maintaining clear, consistent boundaries matters so much during this specific window. And if you're experiencing intensified devaluation instead, understand that this too isn't really about you, however much it might feel like a targeted personal attack. It's evidence that the door has genuinely, functionally closed in their perception, and that the underlying pressure that needed to go somewhere has redirected toward damage control instead of pursuit. Precisely because pursuit no longer seems like a viable path back to stability. This brings us to the sixth and final stage, the one that determines everything about how this entire sequence eventually resolves. And it's worth exploring fully and carefully, because it reveals something genuinely important, not just about narcissistic psychology specifically, but about what determines whether any person, narcissistic or not, eventually finds their way toward something resembling genuine growth, or instead settles permanently into a defended, unchanging version of themselves that simply carries this same unresolved pattern forward. into whoever comes next. Let's move into the sixth and final stage, because it's genuinely the most important one to understand. Not because it resolves neatly, but because it reveals the fork this entire sequence has been building toward from the very beginning: integration or repetition. This stage doesn't have a fixed timeline the way the earlier ones tend to, and unlike the first five, it isn't guaranteed to happen at all. Some narcissists never actually reach it in any meaningful sense, cycling instead between milder versions of the earlier stages indefinitely, applied to whoever becomes their next significant relationship. But for those who do reach something resembling this sixth stage, it splits into two genuinely different outcomes, and understanding both is worth your attention, because it explains a great deal about the range of behavior you might eventually hear about, sometimes years after you've already moved on entirely. The first outcome, integration, is considerably rarer than most people assume, and it's worth being honest about exactly how rare it actually is, because there's a common hope, understandable but often misplaced, that enough time and enough consequence will eventually produce genuine self-reflection in someone who caused real harm. Sometimes it does happen. Integration, in this context, means something specific. The narcissist actually metabolizes the loss honestly, allows themselves to genuinely examine their own role in what happened, rather than only the roles they've assigned to circumstance or to you. And this examination produces some lasting, observable shift in how they approach subsequent relationships. This shift, when it's genuine, tends to be quiet, gradual, and considerably less dramatic than any of the earlier stages we've discussed. It doesn't usually come with grand announcements or elaborate declarations of newfound self-awareness, because performance of exactly this kind of insight, ironically, tends to be one of the clearest signs that genuine integration hasn't actually occurred at all. Here's what's worth understanding about why integration is so much less common than repetition, the second and far more frequent outcome of this final stage. Genuine integration requires tolerating something this entire psychological structure has been built from the very beginning to avoid: the direct, undefended experience of having caused real harm without immediately reaching for a defense, a reframe, or a redirection to make that experience bearable. Remember everything we've traced throughout this entire series about what a narcissist's ego actually protects against: an underlying fragility that cannot easily tolerate shame without collapsing into some form of self-protection. Integration requires sitting with exactly this shame long enough for it to actually produce change, rather than triggering the same defensive cycle that's protected against it throughout every one of the five stages we've already discussed. Repetition, by contrast, is what happens far more often, and it's worth understanding precisely what this actually looks like, because it explains something that confuses a lot of people who eventually hear, sometimes through mutual connections, that their former partner has moved into a new relationship remarkably quickly, sometimes displaying exactly the same early intensity, the same idealization, the same declarations of having finally found something real that once characterized the beginning of the relationship you eventually had to leave. This isn't evidence that you were somehow interchangeable, or that the relationship you experienced meant nothing in any lasting sense. It's evidence that the same underlying instability that produced the original pattern remains unresolved, still searching for the same kind of external stabilization it always required, simply directed now toward a new source rather than toward genuine internal repair. This is worth sitting with directly because it addresses something many people wonder about, sometimes with real pain, in the aftermath of one of these relationships. Does this mean the person who eventually experiences this exact same pattern with them deserved a warning I never received myself? This question deserves an honest, if uncomfortable, answer. You are not responsible for warning every future partner a narcissist eventually encounters, and choosing not to insert yourself into their life again, even for what feels like a protective purpose, isn't a failure of compassion towards strangers you'll likely never meet. Your responsibility was always to your own safety and healing first, and remaining entangled with this person in any capacity, even one that feels altruistic, tends to reopen exactly the dynamic you worked so hard to exit in the first place. Now, let's bring together everything this six-stage sequence actually reveals, because this is where the deepest insight of this entire exploration finally comes into focus. Notice something important about all six stages we've traced, from minimization through narrative construction, testing behavior, grief leakage, escalated pursuit or devaluation, and finally, this fork between integration and repetition. At no point in this entire sequence does your own healing actually depend on which path they eventually take. This is worth understanding as the single most important practical insight available in this entire exploration. You do not need to witness integration in order to heal completely. You do not need confirmation that repetition is happening elsewhere in order to feel validated in your own decision to leave. The entire sequence, all six stages, unfolds according to its own internal logic, largely disconnected from anything you do or don't do after the relationship ends, which means your own recovery was never actually waiting on any of it to resolve in any particular direction. This is genuinely the most freeing understanding available in everything we've traced throughout this entire exploration. You don't need to track which stage they're currently in. You don't need updates from mutual friends about whether the narrative construction has softened, whether testing behavior has stopped, whether grief leakage has produced anything resembling genuine reflection, or whether the new relationship looks like integration or simply repetition wearing a different face. All six of these stages will unfold or won't unfold entirely independent of your attention, and your own healing, your own peace, your own forward momentum were never actually contingent on watching any of it happen in real time. So, if there's one thing worth carrying forward from this entire exploration, let it be this. These six stages exist, and they're genuinely worth understanding, not so you can predict their timing or manage your own behavior around whichever stage seems currently active, but so you can finally, fully release the need to track any of it at all. Whatever happens on their side of this ending, whichever of these six stages they're currently moving through, whichever fork they eventually reach at the very end of the sequence, none of it requires your witness, your management, or your continued attention in order to be real. Your own life, your own healing, your own forward momentum was always available to you independent of theirs, from the very moment you walked away, and it remains entirely, fully yours, regardless of which of these six stages they happen to be experiencing on any given day, month, or year that you, hopefully, are no longer keeping track of at all.